Ever since the invention of the first video game back in 1958, I think everybody has their favorite video game types or video games that they enjoyed the most. And what I wanted to talk about today were video games that I actually found enjoyable and ones that I would say should rank. So I'll be talking about the greatest old school video games that I feel of all time. And by old school, I mean that the game had to come out at least 10 years ago or obviously further back than that. Hey, we'll see. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this video game thing, but hey, let me know if you agree with my list or if you think another video game that I didn't mention should have made the list. But before I dive into the video, please, for me, if you're enjoying the content you're listening to here, like the video, subscribe to the page, hit that notification bell so anytime a new video gets out, it will come directly to you and you'll get notified of that. But without further ado, let me dive in. I have 10 that I'm going to talk about, and in number 10, I have Mario Kart Double Dash. For anyone listening that owned a Nintendo GameCube, I know you own this game, and for anyone that missed out on playing the GameCube at the time, let me tell you that this was by far the greatest Mario Kart game ever made. The game introduced a bunch of new ideas in it, like having 2 people per kart and each person having their own special move. My favorite part about this game was the battle system, in particular the introduction to the bomb battle game. Man, let me tell you that even though the GameCube, in my opinion, was a very underrated console since it sold less than the PS2 and the Xbox One that came out around that same time, this game for me was one of the main reasons why I actually played the GameCube back in the gap. Hopefully in the future, we'll see Nintendo bring back or give us that option of karting for future Mario Kart games, but only time will tell with that. Let's get to my number 9 video game, old school video game of all time. And ladies and gentlemen, that for me happens to be Star Wars: The Old Republic. There has been a lot of Star Wars games down through the years, and this one by far, and I mean literally like a country mile far, is the greatest Star Wars game ever made. This game gave us a glimpse into how the Star Wars galaxy was back before, the movies like Episode 1, for example, and brought to light some of the strongest light and dark Force users we have ever seen in the Force. Some of those I've actually talked about on older videos that I've done for both who I believe are the strongest Sith and strongest Jedi. So if you haven't listened to those videos, go check that out on the page if you're interested. When this game came out, it was only available on PC, and I don't have any numbers to actually support this claim I'm about to say, but I think it helped push gamers who might have been pro console to invest into a PC just to play this particular game. You could play as either a Jedi or Sith, and you got to pick what type within each faction you actually wanted to be. Like mine, for example, was the Sith Juggernaut, but there were many others that were fun to actually build and play. I really hope that some of what we saw in this game actually gets put into live action. But then again, Disney would just mess it up and butcher it, as we've seen them do with a lot of the current Star Wars content. So maybe we'll just leave that greatness to the video game and stick with that. Let me go to my number 8 greatest video game, old school video game of all time, and that is Street Fighter II Turbo. I don't think this is actually debatable or a hot take for me to say that the Street Fighter franchise is the greatest fighting game brand of all time. And of the 35 total games that has come in this franchise's history, I believe Street Fighter II Turbo is the best one. The ability to change pace of play was well made, and the additions to the character pool gave it a new fun feel to it. Some characters actually required you to put in a cheat code that made them unlockable, like Akuma, for example, and being able to play with M. Bison Vega, and Sagat were also great, considering each one of those were bosses you actually had to fight on the way to actually beat the game. The controls were really easy to use, and no matter what console you played the game on, once you actually figured out how the combinations, and how to just flat out just spam like bison slide in the corner on somebody, once you figured that out, your opponent, they were pretty much done, and you were golden at that point, which is why I have Street Fighter II Turbo in number 8. My number 7 game on my list, I have Pokemon, blue, red, and yellow. Kind of lumped them all in together because no matter, if you've actually, played the video games or not, I guarantee you that you've heard of Pokemon or that lovable electrical rat and Pikachu, because this game franchise is that iconic. Having said all that though, out of all the Pokemon games that have been made, I believe the original 3 games that came out for the Game Boy was my favorite and the best of the Pokemon games that we have seen. I know looking back, some of the mechanics of the game was a little wonky, like using a fire type move on an ice and water Pokemon and it actually being not very effective instead of neutral damage, and the critical hit rate was actually tied to a Pokemon's speed, which might actually bother some people listening who actually played that back in the day. But these original games had a simple feel to it that I really actually enjoyed instead of this crap we get now. Like no joke, they actually have mixed breed generation of Pokemon. And if anyone is listening that works for a Pokemon company, it might be time to just let the franchise go. Just let the franchise go, because if you got a mixed breed Pokemon and now you got like a combination of Charizard and Pikachu together, it's time to go. It's time to go ahead and put the game series and franchise to rest. But these games are great, and why we get to see the Pokemon games we actually have today. Let me go to number 6 on my list, and that is, for me, God of War 2. Every God of War game title is great in my opinion, but the best one of them all is the second installment. This game's storyline was the best by far, and seeing Kratos actually get killed after being betrayed by Zeus and then fighting his way back to take his revenge was, it was something to behold. Even though the overall gameplay didn't change much from like the first game, as far as like mechanics go, they did add, some pretty good weaponry, which really helped, show different sides of Kratos' fighting style, if you will. If you've never played God of War game, I would recommend this one here. The next game on my list, I have Super Mario 64. There have been a lot of Mario games down through the years, and every single one of them are really well made and enjoyable. But when Mario 64 came out for the Nintendo 64 in June of 1996, it was a groundbreaking game. Simply put, this is one of the greatest video games ever made. This was the first Mario 3D style game, and it didn't disappoint. The levels were entertaining yet challenging, and what added to the greatness of this game were the stages and the fact that the camera adjustments that you can make to kind of see where you were on point. And for the time for that to come out, if you go back and play it right now, you can still see that, they actually did a really good job setting up camera angles and you being able to adjust that. Every gamer listening right now knows the importance of great camera angles, and for me, the developers at the time did an amazing job. Getting all 120 stars wasn't needed to beat the game, but it was certainly worth the trouble. Getting into the top 4, and at number 4, I have Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Now, I know it might seem like I have a Nintendo 64 bias when it comes to the older consoles, but I can assure you that both Mario 64 and this game belongs this high, or at least should be and should make everybody's list of greatest old school video games of all time. Every Zelda game is at worst good, and this one is either the greatest Zelda video game of all time, or in my opinion, at worst, tied with The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker as the best Zelda game made. This game had everything you can think of that makes an all-time great video game, and then some. The storytelling, boss fights, a great villain, amazing weapons, and outstanding stages. I still remember as a youth getting so mad that I couldn't figure out that water temple that I threw my controller out the window because I was so pissed. That said, there isn't one negative aspect of the game I could actually think of other than that dang water temple. But Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, a magnificent game, and to this day, still stands the test of time. In my third slot for greatest video games, I have Final Fantasy VI. There have been a ton of Final Fantasy titles made down through the years, and every fan of the series has their favorite. But for me, Final Fantasy VI or 3, when it came out here in America, is the greatest one ever made, in my opinion. You might have heard me say how I love when villains of the show or video game or movie wins or succeeds with their initial plan. The villain of the story, Kefka, was able to pull this off, which caused the world to shatter and the heroes having to come back together after being separated. Like I mentioned with the Legend of Zelda, there simply isn't one bad thing I can say about this video game. It had everything. This was the first game that I actually took time to completely master. For all the gamers out there listening, you already know what I'm talking about. Much like Final Fantasy VII got a remake here, and I think they're actually about to come out with a Final Fantasy VII 2 remake. I think, and I would vote for Final Fantasy VI to actually have a remake, because if they do, boy, that's gonna be lit. Let's go to my number 2 video game of all time, greatest old school video game of all time, and that is Super Smash Brothers Melee. And that one was on a Nintendo GameCube as well. So, of the 5 Super Smash Brothers games, this one is the best, and in my opinion, the greatest collab video game of all time. Even though I do want to give a shout out to the original collab or crossover fighting game ever made, and that was X-Men vs. Street Fighter. The first time we actually seen that. To get back on track though, the thing that makes Super Smash Brothers Melee even more unique than all the other fighting games is the 4-player aspect. This Smash Brothers title expanded on the one we actually got for the Nintendo 64. It introduced a ton more memorable characters like Ganondorf, Peach, Bowser, Mewtwo, Ice Climbers, Marth, and 2 characters in one, Zelda and Sheik, to name a few characters that they added, and the game played a lot smoother than the original game. Some of the changes done in this game compared to the first one made you think about what character you would have to use and why. What I mean by that is, for example, in the first game, everyone had a pretty strong throw move, but this one, certain characters actually throw moves was actually stronger depending on the character, like Mewtwo's having a stronger throw than, say, Link. The main story mode of the game wasn't the best, but let's be honest, hardly anyone plays a fighting game for the main story mode. No one ever does that in a fighting game. If you have another person to play with, you could have an outstanding time with this game. And even if you didn't, battling against 3 level 9 computer characters will also give you that same level of fun. Now, before I get into my number 1 old school video game of all time, let me actually give some honorable mentions here of some games that didn't get into my top 10, but I thought deserved an honorable mention. And the first one is Super Mario RPG. Man, let me tell you, I really wanted to put this game in my top 10. I really did, because it was just that good of a game. So good that it's getting a remake on the Nintendo Switch here pretty soon. This game's storyline was really well written, and to top it off, we got introduced to brand new characters to the Mario franchise. It's also pretty cool when you see Mario and Bowser actually come together to fight a bigger threat. The next is Secret of Mana. In my opinion, this is a very underrated RPG and one of the greatest RPGs made for the Super Nintendo. The thing that made this game great was the unique play style and the memorable characters like Randy and Prim. Even though it couldn't, of course, make my list, this game still deserves a shout out. The next game is NFL Blitz. Before Madden became the end-all be-all for football games, this game used to be it for a lot of football game lovers, and I was one of those people. Now, this game was nothing like a traditional football game since it was based more on the fiction side, but the fun factor and sure pissed off way this game would make you feel and why is what made this game so great. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare makes my shout out list when this game was released back in November of 2007. To be honest, up to that point, the Call of Duty franchise and series actually really needed a pickup, and this one delivered. The thing that made this game so great outside of it being playable on PC was the shortened gameplay. The prior game was well over 10 hours to complete, which felt like a long time for a first-person shooter game. Also, the game mechanics were a ton more smoother than other shooters that we actually had at the time. The next one is Mortal Kombat 2. So this game offered an expanded roster from the first installment of Mortal Kombat, and I think it was the best of the old school Mortal Kombat games. The other cool feature this game offered is secret characters that could be unlocked like Nabu Sabed, Shao Kahn, and Smoke, and expanded stage fatalities. The next honorable mention will go to the original Gran Turismo. This one was the first racing game of its time that allowed you to customize your car. And I'm just not talking about changing your tire and paint of the car. Though the customization of your car is what made this game legendary, the tracks and getting your licenses is also a great part of this game. This game was so epic, it actually inspired a video game player to actually become a professional driver, and a movie is actually getting made about it. The next game on my list, GoldenEye 007. The first ever shooter that I actually played, and back in the gap when this game dropped for the Nintendo 64, I can almost guarantee that everyone who had an N64 owned this game. It was iconic for its time in first-person shooting style games. The only shooter back at the time that could compete was Doom, but, me personally, I preferred GoldenEye. And my last honorable mention goes to Final Fantasy VII, arguably the most played and famous of the Final Fantasy franchise. Final Fantasy VII gave us some memorable characters like Aerith, Barret, Tifa, Cloud, and an all-time great villain in Sephiroth. The storytelling in this game, amongst a lot of side quests, summons, and secret bosses, is why this game is so beloved by many and easily recognized by even casual people who've never actually even played the game. To get to number one on my list, ladies and gents, I know some of you listening might have never played the World of Warcraft. But let me be the first to tell you that first, I'm sorry that you didn't get to play it and you didn't get to experience the greatness that this game has that made it the greatest video game of all time. I know this game isn't as popular now as it was back in the gap, but at its height, it was something special. The Burning Crusade, or BC for my WoW players out there listening, was the best expansion of this franchise and offered some of the most jaw-dropping things I have ever witnessed in a video game. I don't mean to ramble, but I'm about to because of my fondness for this game. I remember when this expansion was released and my guild that was basically me and some of my homeboys from our guild. We were standing in line in the code in the front of GameStop waiting for the release of this expansion at the time because it was going to be released at like 12 a.m. And we did that so that way we could rush home and download it and get a head start on some of the new content. We played on a PvP server too, so trying to get through the Dark Portal was crazy at the time. But, good times nonetheless. Jumping back over to why this game is the greatest though, and still is because it's still out. The additions to the game like flying mounts, the PvP arena, and the storyline with Illidan and Kil'jaeden was one of the best writings done for any video game I have ever played. Even though the original World of Warcraft came out way back in the ancient year of 2004, it still ranks in the top 10 of all online video games played to this day and is the #1 MMORPG played currently. This game almost 20 years old and it's still going strong. My greatest video game ever made, whether it be old school or new school, but for the sake of this list, old school. But let me know what y'all think in the comments. Let me know y'all's list. I'm curious to hear it, or maybe you just agree. But until next time, I'll talk to you all later. Peace.